This is not going to make noises as new mail comes in. And this is Dr. Yee, Dr. Eiling Yee. And Eiling received her bachelor's, I guess, from the University of Rochester. And then she spent a couple of years in George Washington University, I believe. No, where was it?
Now I forget. Georgetown University.
Georgetown. Well, I got the George bit right. You can tell from my accent that I'm not from around these parts. So George Washington, Georgetown, it's all the same. And then she went off and did her PhD after that at Brown University. She did a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania in Department of Brain and Cognitive Science, and then spent some years in northern Spain in the Basque region at the Basque Center for Brain and Language for a few years before coming here, coincidentally at the same time that I arrived. We both have a course that we teach and a child that we raise, and you'll hear more about that later.
And yeah, we're just really happy to be here talking to you. I've known about ALL for decades through hearing about the fascinating classes my parents have taken, Sam and Nancy, discussing with my mom, Nancy, all the classes she taught, and hearing about their involvement more generally. So we're really excited to be able to be part of this great program. So full disclosure, the topic we're going to be talking about today is not either of our main research interests. We both study language and cognition, but I study sort of adult conceptual knowledge, and Jerry studies sentence processing, our event knowledge. But we've been team teaching this upper level undergraduate class on the psychology of language for years here at UConn. And we always have fun doing this lecture. We think it's one of the most interesting topics. Generally what we do is I'll give one lecture and Jerry will interrupt, and Jerry will give another lecture and I'll interrupt. So we do try to make it pretty dynamic. But this time, since we're just giving one lecture, I'm going to start, then we're going to go over to Jerry, back to me, and back to Jerry. So we'll try to keep it interesting. And yeah, we will probably be interrupting each other. And you guys should feel free to interrupt us, I would say. Yeah, you're good with that too? Good. You can either just unmute yourself to ask questions, or you can raise your hand. I don't have the chat window up, so I'm not going to recommend you use the chat because I won't see it. All right, so can everyone hear okay before we start the real thing? Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, so let us go. So we'll be talking today about babies, words, and statistics, and how infants learn about words. And
before we do that, I just want to remind you that UConn is the basketball capital of the world. So some of you may know that we are host to champion basketball players, and there's the basketball. And we also have this really scary dog as our mascot,
Husky.
Husky. So that's why these two things are on our title page.
And we have taught two of the championship basketball players in our psychology of language class, one from the women's team, Nika Moole, and one from the men's team, Andrew Hurley.
Who's the son of the coach.
Yes. All right. So that's our claim to fame. All right. All right. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to try to talk about how kids learn words. As adults, we often kind of take for granted our ability to understand language, unless something goes wrong. But if you're in a foreign country, for instance, where they speak a language that you've never heard before, the problem of recognizing and learning words becomes very clear. It just sounds like this sort of continuous stream of sounds. It probably sounds like people are talking really fast. And you can't tell where one word ends and another word begins, let alone which sounds refer to which things. And basically children, infants, are in that situation. They're born in that situation, and they also don't have adult cognitive capacities. And despite this, they're able to learn words remarkably fast. So what we have here is on the y-axis is just number of words that kids understand according to parental report. For 1-year-olds, by 1 year, on average, there's a lot of variability, but on average, 1-year-olds can understand about 50 words. By 3 years old, believe it or not, we've actually had to change the scale. So this is 50. By 3 years old, they know about 1,000 words. They understand about 1,000 words. Oops. And by, sorry, I hit the wrong button. By 3-year-olds, they know about 1,000. And by 5, we're going to have to change the scale again. Like this is 50. This is 1,000. This is 10,000. By 5, they know about 10,000 words. They understand about 10,000 words. And as adults, it depends how you count what a word is, but an adult vocabulary of a native speaker tends to be around 60,000 words, let's say. Okay, so we know a lot of words. So the main questions we'll be trying to get at today is, how is it that infants are able to get words out of this sort of continuous blah, blah, blah of speech? And once they do that, how is it they're able to learn what words mean? Which words refer to which things? Which words refer to which parts of things? So those are our two main questions. Okay, but before we start, some of you, if you're like my dad, for instance, I did my PhD on spoken word recognition, and I remember telling my dad this, and he said, but I don't really get the problem here because words are discrete units. Like there's one word and there's another word. Why is there this problem figuring out where one word begins and another word ends? You know, I tried to give the analogy of being in a foreign country, but if you know the language, it really sounds like we really have this perception that we can tell where one word begins and another ends because there are gaps or silences between words. Was there a question there? No. Okay. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of just visual representation that intuition is actually not. It's not true. There are no silences between words. So this is actually an audio, a speech waveform. This is time on the x-axis, and this is just pressure or intensity here on the y-axis. And it's me saying there are no silences between words. And you might say, all right, there's no total silences between words, but there are certainly some spots of lower energy. So maybe that's there. Maybe this is R. That could be no. That could be silences. That could be between. And that could be words, right? So maybe we just use bits of low energy. That I will show you will not actually be a good strategy, because if you were to do that, this is what you would get. There are no silence between words, right? So you can't really use the bits of low energy to try to figure out where one word ends and another one begins. Okay, so there is a problem. And kids are in an even bigger problem. You might think as adults, we might recognize one word, figure out what it is, and then, okay, if we're hearing something new, that's the beginning of the next word. But words are often learned in the context of other words which are not known. And for kids, that's for infants, they know nothing. So that is the problem. So that's the question we're going to be getting at. How is it, given this continuous wall of sound, this continuous stream of sound, how does the child manage to recognize patterns in this continuous stream of speech? How are they able to segment the word boundaries? That means how are they able to find the beginning of one word or the end of that word, the beginning of the next? How are they able to segment words from that continuous stream of speech? And now I'm going to turn it over to Jerry, who's going to be talking about some of the methods that are used and some of the discoveries that have been made about how babies segment words.
Okay, so I'm going to just start by focusing on how we describe this speech as a stream of speech. And I kind of like the parallel between a stream of water that you can imagine pebbles on the side and the water's flowing. We tend to think of speech as pebbles strung together, and there are these boundaries that we now know there aren't. That's what Eiling just said. Speech is much more like the water, this continuous stream that's flowing, and you can't see where one bit of water begins and another bit of water ends. So I'm going to describe some work by Jen Safran from the University of Wisconsin, and she showed how infants can use statistics based on essentially tracking how often patterns occur in that stream to then extract some memory of those patterns, to form some memory of those patterns, which will then go on to become words. So what she did was mimic the problem, if you like, the challenge for parent and child. So the parent has a vocabulary consisting of 60 to 70,000 words. So we're going to take a much, much smaller example. We are, for the purpose of this lecture, going to imagine giving a computer a vocabulary. That's what Jen Safran did. Her vocabulary is a little bit bigger than I'm going to show you. I'm just showing you a smaller version so that we can keep track of things ourselves. So she gave the computer a vocabulary of words: bida, kubi, doku, tido, and dati. These are essentially, they don't make any sense to us as adults and certainly not to children. But as we've just explained, there are no gaps between the words. So she had the computer generate sequences of these words, but without the gaps. And I'm hoping that you're going to be able to hear the example of this as we play it.
Golabu pado tibi daku tu piro golabu pado ti golabu bidaku tu piro pado ti golabu tu piro pado tibi daku.
Okay, so were people able to hear that? It was sort of, yeah. So it was generated by a computer, and it's really this very boring sequence of words. And so we're mimicking again what the adult is providing to the child. And the child, we're hoping, is going to extract the same words that the adult has in their brain. And in this case, I've pointed out which are the intended patterns that one want the child to extract. Now, again, this is just describing, setting up an experiment that was done where a computer was generating these sequences. And the question is, what happens when you give these sequences to children? The problem is that there are these intended patterns that we've shown you down here that map on to the words that the computer had in its vocabulary. But the child could also extract these patterns that are due to when the end of one word meets the beginning of another. So if we look at these two words, bida and kubi, when you string them together, bida, kubi, you have daku. That's not an intended word, that's an incidental pattern. So the question is, what is the child going to extract when you have them listening to this sequence of sounds? How could they possibly decide which are the intended patterns and which are the incidental patterns that are due to these accidental joining up of one word with another? So this is what we want the child to be able to extract, the words that correspond to what the computer thought it was stringing together. We don't want the child to extract these incidental patterns. So first of all, let's find out what the child does, and then let's see how they might do it. So just to remind you, these are the words that the child is hearing, but they're strung together in a sequence. And these are the incidental word-like patterns that the child is hearing as a part of that sequence. The child is hearing bi, da, ku, bi as part of that sequence, but also da, ku, bi, do that we do not want the child to extract. So which patterns does the child learn from these sequences? So I'm going to describe what Jen Safran did. She did this with 8-month-old infants, and she would play sequences just like the one you heard for about 2 minutes. There were various versions of this study. One of them, it was really a short period of time, about 2 minutes. And the child was just sat there playing. Their carer, their mom or dad or other carer was just next to them. But essentially the child was just crawling around on the floor. To find out what the child learned, they used a particular procedure called the head turn procedure. And I'm going to explain to you how we use this procedure to figure out what the child is encoding from the speech stream. So here's how the procedure works. This is a bird's eye view looking down on top of the child. I know it doesn't look like that. Unfortunately, I couldn't prepare a really good graphic. But what happens is you've got a loudspeaker on the left of the child, a loudspeaker on the right of the child, and you have these bulbs that are going to light up at particular times to attract the attention of the child. So the light bulb in the middle will light up and the child will look at it. That's what that red line illustrates, the direction of gaze of the child. Once they have the child's attention, they now turn on a light next to one of the loudspeakers, and the loudspeaker starts to play out a sound. It might be bida or daku. In fact, it will be bida, 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 or daku, daku, daku. Now, you may not remember this, but bida was actually one of the intended words, and daku was one of the incidental patterns. So what one is interested in this experiment is, how long does it take for the child to lose interest and move away and look somewhere else? And what they do is they measure the time it takes to lose interest, depending on whether they're listening to an intended word or an incidental pattern. What they found was that children attended more, and this may seem strange, to the incidental patterns. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But the key thing is that they responded differently to the words and to the incidental patterns. They actually spent more time listening to the incidental patterns. Now, when you think about it, that actually makes sense, that pattern, because if I know a word, I know the word. If I hear a new word, I need to attend more to it. Okay, so the child can discriminate. And so they assumed that what was going on is that infants are using statistics, I'll come to that in just a moment, to generate stored patterns of words. And the question is, how? In what way are they using statistics?
We haven't explained that at all.
We haven't explained that at all. So now I'm going to try and explain it a little bit. So here is the original sequence that they heard. Here are the incidental patterns that they could be extracting. And here are the words that are a part of that sequence. Now, you'll notice that there are about twice as many incidental patterns as there are word patterns. And within this sequence, every word pattern appears twice, but every incidental pattern appears just once.
Yeah.
So there are 2 occurrences of bida, but only 1 occurrence of daku. And so what this means is we have twice as many instances of the words we care about, which means that our memory for those instances, of course, this is unconscious memory, is stronger because we've encountered those words more often. And that's what we mean by statistics. It's essentially counting, not numerically 1, 2, 3, 4, but keeping track and generating a stronger and stronger trace of each word every time it occurs. I've now completely forgotten what the next slide is going to be, so I'm going to press the button. Okay, so they've got patterns.
But let's go back to that for 1 sec, because I just want to add one thing. So this was done with 8-month-olds, but you might imagine that kids start to learn words earlier, and they do. Actually, analog of this study was actually done with 2-day-old infants. So it wasn't with the head turn procedure, it was with electrophysiology. They put a cap on their heads to measure the electrical impulses coming from firing neurons. And there were different, even after just 2 minutes of hearing this, bida, kupi, doku, etc., these 2-day-old infants, they showed different brain activation patterns, different neural activity for word patterns versus incidental patterns. So really, this is something that starts very, very young.
And I did not know that.
Well,
So
there you go.
I've learned something new just now also. This is why I love teaching with Eiling. Okay, so they have these patterns, but what is the consequence of having them? Because again, you might have realized that these intended word patterns they were more frequent, so they have a stronger trace, but that doesn't mean that we don't have any trace of these patterns. So is there some consequence of this difference in the strength of the trace? And in fact, there is, and it's a very important consequence in respect of the ability of the child to then go on and attach meaning to these things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that work was done by a student of Jen Safran, Catherine Graf-Estes. It was actually done in 2007. The dates don't really matter. I put this date up to remind me that it took about 10 years between the first study that showed that statistical learning and this study that showed the consequence of that learning. So this science is a very slow-moving science. Slow-moving, because it's very hard to do this kind of work with babies and young infants. So what she found was that after this exposure to these sequences, while the child was just there playing, infants were better able to map meaning onto the words than onto the incidental patterns. So what they would do is they would, for example, show this novel object and say, look, a bida, where bida was one of the word patterns. Or they would show the same object and say, look, a kuti, where kuti was one of the incidental patterns. And what they found was that babies better learned the association between that novel object and the intended word, the real word, than they did learn the association between that object and the incidental pattern kuti. I'll show you now the kind of technique that they use for that. Similar kind of thing. There's a bird's eye view. Now the infant has been shown these objects. They've heard, look, a kuti, or look, a bida. And what's going to happen now is a light's going to come on, attracts the attention of the child. The light's going to go off, and then the microphone is going to play either kuti or bida, and the screens are going to show two objects. And the question is, how long does the child spend looking at that object when they're hearing bida? How long do they spend looking at it when they're in the condition when they where they have heard kuti? The incidental word. And so you just measure the amount of time they spend looking at the picture. And it turns out that, again, the children look more at the picture when they're hearing bida than when they're hearing kuti. Those children that were told, look, a bida, versus those children who are told, look, a kuti. So the association that formed between the label bida or the potential label kuti, the association that formed between that label and the object was stronger when it was the intended word pattern than when it was the incidental pattern. So there is a consequence to these statistics. They determine how easy it is to associate a meaning, in this case, a visual object, with that sound. And at this point, I think I'm going to hand back to Eiling, who's much more fluent than me.
Definitely.
And she will now go on to the next part about a little bit more about how we associate meanings with these labels.
All right. I see a question. Yes.
Hi. How is this all affected by prenatal exposure, say listening to music, reading aloud? I would think that that would have some kind of effect.
Yeah. So you can actually see effects of prenatal exposure. For instance, if a mom reads, or particular, there was a study with a Dr. Seuss book. They read Cat in the Hat like every day for, oh God, what was it?
Only about 3 weeks.
For a few weeks, while they were still in the womb. And then after they were born, they tested the infants on their preference for the Cat in the Hat versus another nursery rhyme. And they showed that indeed the infants preferred the Cat in the Hat. So they were able to discriminate between something they'd heard prenatally and something and things they had not heard. So they are getting this input. And
in fact, it's a really interesting question you ask, because the reason that the infant can do that is because they are learning about the rhythms of their language, the sort of little tunes that accompany the language.
Right.
In the womb, the child doesn't get enough information that would allow them to distinguish between the b sound and a d sound, for example. That's because of all the liquid and tissue surrounding the fetus. So all they're really getting is that rhythmic sound and that sort of tune to the language. And it turns out that's actually very, very important. But we're not going to be able to talk about that today.
I do have a lecture on.
We have a lecture on that. That's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions for now?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What if you have one parent who speaks Spanish and another who speaks English? How does that work out?
That's a fantastic question. A lot of different answers to that question. So yeah, I mean, in general, if you get input from two different languages, Spanish and English, for instance, kids are able very early on to distinguish between the languages, to figure out which words go with English and which words go with Spanish. Their vocabularies do tend to develop a little bit more slowly in each language. So, you know, at a point where a monolingual might have 100 words, the bilingual, if it's like equal input from the two languages, might have 50 words in Spanish and 50 words in English. So they actually have a similar size vocabulary if you count the two languages, but each one develops more slowly, kind of in proportion to the input. Parents sometimes get kind of panicked or, you know, distressed because often they start producing language a little more slowly. So, you know, while there's a monolingual, let's say, might start producing it, it varies, but let's say, you know, a few words at a year and a bunch of words by 2, the bilingual that production might be a little bit slower, but they do catch up, especially by school age. So we always tell our students, you know, just do it, teach your kids multiple languages, it's worth it. They can actually speak 2 languages then. So there's all of these huge benefits. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just that my parents weren't English, and I regret that they did not speak to me in English, did not speak to me in Spanish. But nonetheless, just hearing it, like the children in this experiment, the infants in this experiment, I learned which were the words of Spanish, and I learned their meanings. So I could understand them. And at about 5 years old, my parents were speaking to one another at the table in Spanish. My father, I still remember this, my father asked my mother to pass the water, the jug, but I reached for the jug and passed the water over. And boy, were they shocked. And then they had me go and open the cupboard, go and open the door, pick this up. And they realized I understood what they were saying. So much like these infants that I just described, those infants were really just passively listening to the language. They were not interacting in the language. They were not interacting with any things that the language was referring to. But like them, I could extract those patterns and eventually associate meanings with them.
Wow. Thank you.
All right. Other questions for now? All right, let's move on then. Okay, so Jerry talked about extracting patterns from the continuous speech stream and a little bit about how it's easier to map a meaning onto a pattern you're familiar with, more familiar with, than a pattern you're less familiar with. But let's say you get the, how is it that kids are actually able to get the correct meaning, map the correct label on the correct object? For instance, how do they know that something refers, you know, the word car refers to the whole object and not just one part of that thing? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit now. I can get into the right window. Okay, so this is work done by Ellen Markman years ago, I think when she was at Stanford, but she's at Stanford now. And what she observed is that infants appear to have some biases when learning labels for objects. One is what she called the whole object bias, which is kind of what I just alluded to. So when they hear a label, for instance, if they see this and they hear the word car, they don't know that word yet, they're infants, they take the label to refer to the whole object, the whole thing, rather than just part of it, rather than, for instance, the wheels or the headlamps over here. So they seem to show this bias. And that, of course, helps them, right? Because it really narrows down the possibilities of things that words can refer to. Another one that helps them a lot, another bias that helps them a lot, is what she called mutual exclusivity, which really means just what it sounds like. So if once infants already start knowing labels for things, they can sort of use that to build on their knowledge. So if they already know the label of an object and they hear a new label, they take that to refer to a different object. So for instance, let's say our baby learned that this is a car, and then they see these two things in front of them. They hear mom refer to fire truck, and they assume that fire truck refers to this other object they don't already have a label for, rather than being a new label for car. And again, you can see how that would really help infants sort of not have this problem of trying to figure out what, if anything could have multiple labels, then you really have this huge problem for word learning. Okay, so those are two biases. But what if we're in the kind of normal situation of there being more than one thing in our environment, and we don't know, the normal situation for babies, I should say, and we don't know the name of any of these things. So this was work just done 16 years ago, by Linda Smith and Chen Yu at University of Indiana. And this was a really, really important finding in understanding how infants learn. So as I said, we often refer to one thing among many, and we may not know what any of those things are. We may not have the labels for any of those things. So the question is, how can an infant figure out which object a label should be applied to? So I'm going to test you guys first. So let's say I show you these two novel things. Just pretend you don't know, even if you know what they are, pretend you don't know what either of these things are. And I say, one of these is a blet and the other one is a stip. Okay, now, hopefully you will basically be in the situation where infants are and be like, I have no idea which one is which, completely lost. But how about I then show you another two pictures and say, one of these is a crat, the other one is a stip. Now, can anyone tell me which thing is which, given the information I have provided you with?
Of course. Yeah.
All right, so if you are doing what probably most adults do with logic, is they're saying, okay, right, these two things, one is a blet, one is a stip, I don't know which one is which, but here, one is a crat, the other one is a stip. Well, I guess this one has to be the stip, and this one has to be the crab, given what I learned in a minute ago. Okay, so you kind of use logic in the process of elimination to figure out what's what. So the question is, can 12-month-old infants do the same thing? They don't have our sort of, complicated, or not complicated, but our logic, our ability to do sort of more complicated reasoning, presumably. Can they do the same thing? And disclosure, the answer is yes. So how did they find this out? What they did is kind of like what we just did. They presented them, the babies, with two things, and they might say, look, blet, look, stip, without helping them figure out which one is which. And then later on, okay, so the infant can't tell what's what. Later on, they say, look, crat, look, stip. And of course, the infant can't tell which one is which. There's absolutely no way for them to tell which one is which unless the infant has a memory of what they heard before, and not an explicit memory necessarily, just the ability to keep track of what they were hearing before. So let me just kind of break that down. So just to break it down, as you probably sort of are getting the idea, in what we saw, blet, appeared in or was heard in the context of these two things. Stip was also, we said look, let, look, stip. So stip was also heard in the context of these two things. Excuse me. Crat was heard in the context of these two things. And stip was also heard in the context of these two things. So taken alone, there's no way, taken each situation all by itself, there's no way for the baby to figure out which word refers to which object. But what sort of Smith and you wanted to show was that babies actually can keep track of the statistics. So if they can keep track of the statistics, then they realize, right, stip occurred twice with this thing. So this one has to be the stip. Okay. So that is what they call cross-situational word learning, and really showed that what seemed to be an impossible problem, if you just think about one situation at a time, isn't so impossible. And that babies as young as 12 months old actually are able to keep track of the statistics of the input. And if I'm right, this is the transition. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say that. Oh dear, I got ahead of myself. Right. One thing I forgot to say is they also talk about, or we talk about, the mechanism that probably underlies this process. So the mechanism of Hebbian learning, which you might have heard about before, the idea that neurons that fire together, wire together. And it's basically just the neurophysiological theory that if you have a stimulus that occurs in just before another one, the neural activity that corresponds to those, the axons, or they will connect more, the wires between these neurons, the connectivity between these neurons will become stronger. And so it's easier to associate one thing with the other thing.
This is more than a theory. This was observed
And there's data.
neurons by,
Yes.
it's called Hebbian learning because Donald Hebb in the 40s observed this. And it was quite important because it people could see how it underlay an awful lot of work that had been done in animal learning. So things like Pavlovian conditioning that you may have heard of, where dogs would hear the sound of a buzzer just before being fed, and after a while they would salivate once they heard the buzzer, even though the food hadn't appeared yet. The reason it's worth mentioning Hebbian learning is that the principle behind Hebbian learning is actually one of the foundational principles that underlies modern artificial intelligence and things like ChatGPT and these other language models. So it's a very, very important part of what's around us every day. One little historical fact is that the reason that Linda Smith got involved in this is that she could see that link between the animal learning and the human learning. So she was one of the first people to draw that link and make the link together.
All right. So if, I'm hoping what's coming next, what I think is, okay, oh, right, I need to go back here. Okay, so yes, so now I'm going to turn it back over to Jerry, because if you've been thinking about it, what I was talking about actually relates directly to what he was talking about, and I'll let him elaborate on that.
So I'm just going to draw your attention to this idea then from the Hebbian learning that brain cells that encode the memory of a word, for example, become more strongly connected to the brain cells that encode the memory of the thing. So that's the mechanism that underpins the learning that Eiling has just been talking about with these funny things here. But it turns out that we've seen this thing before. We've seen this mechanism before with this sequence of words made up by the computer. We've got them in black and blue just so that you can see where the words end and begin. And we can think of these word patterns as sequences of syllables. So an intended word is bida, where the syllable B is followed by the syllable da. The incidental pattern would be where, for example, B is followed by do. So here we have be followed by da. It's part of an actual word. And over here, for example, we have be followed by t, which is an incidental pattern. And we have, and here's be followed by do, which again is an incidental pattern. If we were to count these patterns, what we would see is that be is followed by da twice as often as be is followed by do, or be is followed by t. So the association between be and da is going to be strengthened through this process of Hebbian learning more than the association between be and do. So the beautiful thing here, and this is, one of the reasons we always enjoy giving this lecture, is the same underlying mechanism can explain how it is that we recognize recurring patterns in the speech stream, and how it is that we can associate meanings with those stored patterns. And I think at this point,
Go ahead, sorry.
we are coming very close to the end, but I've lost
I put
the
it down there. That's my bad. There.
cursor. So I'm just going to summarize very briefly, but there's a little sort of postscript to this. So, word learning, it's all statistics. Whether recognizing recurring patterns in the speech or associating meaning with those patterns. And amazingly, I think, we know enough about this process that we can actually point to the physiological mechanisms inside the brain that are responsible for these. And that's, very, very exciting. So there isn't this blah, 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 and then the baby not really knowing what's going on. Actually, the baby does know quite soon, is able to extract patterns and associate meaning. So I want to end with the postscript, which is why on earth, first of all, am I showing a paper back? And why did we choose to present this work to you? So we were lucky enough to be in Paris in January. And I think it was there that our 6-year-old child really started to think about how is it we get to learn another lange.
Probably
and then,
because he doesn't speak French.
He
And so
doesn't
he's
speak
hearing a lot of a foreign language.
But then he started to think about why or how did he even manage to learn English? So he asked us, how do babies learn words
And they don't
when
know anything.
they don't know anything? They don't know words, they don't know meaning. So I said to him, well, tomorrow morning I will explain. And this is the importance of the paper bag. The following morning, we were in a cafe, as we would tend to be each morning. And he would like to get a croissant. So I handed this bag to him and said, here's a Pauline, a made-up word. And he took the bag and took the croissant out. And then I said to him, let me take the boulin. And I took the bag away. Now, at this point, I should say he was quite interested in eating the croissant. But he now told us that he knew what those two words meant. He knew that because I had said boulin as I took the bag away, the boulin must refer to the bag. And therefore, Pauline must refer to the thing that was left. Very similar to the kinds of things that we saw those infants doing. Now, it turns out we don't really know what he thought Pauline meant. It could have meant croissant, it could have meant pastry to him, or it could have meant breakfast. Each one of those would have been right, because each one of those essentially had the same function, which is you eat it. And so what's really interesting here is that we see there is a stage in word learning where it doesn't matter that they may not know the exact adult label, but they know what kind of thing it is. And we have a colleague here at UConn who's actually sort of discovered this aspect of word learning, which is, very, very exciting. Okay, so what I didn't tell you is that Kai actually got very upset the day before, the 6-year-old. Sorry, I forgot to say his name is Kai. He had got really upset the day before, trying to figure out how could he have learned any words if he didn't know about words to begin with. He was crying. So it mattered to him. We hope it matters to you. Oh, I thought I'm getting
just like Kai.
emotional thinking about Kai, who it really bothered him.
Mm.
And so that's another reason we love talking about this, because it really matters to children. We just don't realize it. So that's it.
Right.
That's
Kai in the cafe or a different
and
cafe.
different cafe. And that's us done.
Right. So questions. We are very happy to take questions. And I thought I saw something in the chat, but now I've lost the chat window. Oh, there it is.
I always get emotional when I think of Kai getting emotional. I just can't help it.
Oh, nice. I see.
It is never too soon to start talking to a baby, no matter where they are.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear them. The turn taking is one of the first things they learn.
And in case you're curious, the auditory system on which basis they can start learning those rhythms of their language is generally believed to be starting to function around 7 months of gestation. So they have a couple of months to do all that listening before they pop out.
Yes. Yes. Paul. Oh, not Paul, but Paul's
Anyway,
camera.
Carol.
Carol.
Well, this may be for another class altogether, but I'm just curious about loss of one of your senses, hearing, eyesight, and how that all plays into it. I mean, it would probably have to be a completely different learning curve, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so that's a good one. One of our colleagues here actually studies deaf kids, congenitally deaf kids. And it turns out that if they are in an environment with native signers, if their parents are native signers or their caretakers are native signers, then their learning trajectory actually looks very similar. They use the same kinds of mechanisms to map, in this case, the visual onto the other, the visual sign onto the other thing in the world, or the visual word onto the other thing in the world. In fact, they actually start being able to produce sooner, because kids who use spoken language, it's really hard to manipulate our articulators, our tongue and our lips and all that stuff. And kids are actually better at signing, have better control over their fingers at an earlier age than we do our vocal apparatus. So that's if they have this rich sign language input. Of course, if they don't, then there can be some actually very significant delays and actually non-linguistic problems as a result of not getting language exposure early on.
But one interesting fact about sign language for those children who are born into a signing family or signing community, it turns out that the rhythm of sign language, the rhythms of the sign language that they use, map onto the rhythms of the spoken language that they were exposed to in utero. And so there's a very nice parallel there. So the learning that they've done in utero is absolutely not wasted.
Thank you.
All right, we got 3 more. I think I saw Denise first.
Okay, you spoke about a mother who spoke, I believe, English and a father who spoke Spanish. What would be the effect if one of the parents or both of the parents spoke both languages and they switched back and forth between the 2 languages? Would that confuse the child? Or if a grandmother, for example, which would be me, my daughter would very much like me to speak French to my granddaughter, but and up until now, I've only spoken English to her. And I've thought about, well, what if we only spoke French when we were in a certain place in the house, for example?
Yeah.
What is the effect of the switching back and forth?
So the advice that is often given to parents who speak different languages is for one parent to speak one and the other parent to speak another. So there's a very clear context that defines one language versus another.
I will say though, although that helps the baby discriminate the languages, they don't need that. They will be able very early on to learn to distinguish between the languages. So really, there might be a little bit of confusion early on, but it will not be a problem. One reason they ask people to do that though also is if both parents speak both languages, sometimes there'll be like a bias towards one or the other. And so the kid will just start producing only in one and they won't learn the other one as well. Whereas if one really commits to only speaking French, then the kid will say, okay, I have to speak French to grandma, and they'll start producing the French too.
And one reason that even if you mix the languages, it may not matter so much is often different languages have different rhythms, and
French certainly.
Children are very, very sensitive to these differences. So the rhythm provides a context that allows them to separate the language. So you can never do wrong by speaking the other language, and it may appear as if the child might take a word from the wrong language, but that is actually lasts a fairly short time, and one shouldn't worry about that. Children just manage that.
I mean, to be fair, an older kid who understands some of their first language will get a little annoyed at first, but it's worth it, I think.
And basically, once children hit puberty, they become adults, and as you know, adults find it quite hard to learn a second language. So the sooner one can start, the better.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I think I saw Wayne next.
Yes, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I have some comments, no particular question regarding parents speaking a different language. I was born and raised in northern Indiana in a German community. I was born in 41 before December 7. And my parents spoke German to each other, but not to my brother or me. They spoke English. And the adults, occasionally when speaking to each other, would speak German. And then when they'd speak to the children, it would be in English. So I did not learn German. My first language was English. But when I got to graduate school, I had to take 2 languages. I took German. I had to start from scratch. That was my experience. And by the way, hi, Sam. Hi, Nancy.
Thank you. Yeah. I wonder if you learned it a little bit better, though. It was a little easier for your ear to pick up the sounds. That's one thing that's been studied, whether kids who are exposed to a language early on, when they're older, if they're not exposed to it for a while and they try to pick it up when they're older, whether it's easier for them to discriminate the speech sounds than for someone who's never exposed to it when they were young.
I'm not sure about that, but starting from scratch after 5 weeks, I was able to pick up a Bible in the German language, open it at random, and have my wife find the same passage in an English Bible. And without seeing the English Bible, I could give a rough translation off the top of my head.
Sounds like you had some advantage. Yeah, good. Yes, Adele, did you have a question?
First of all, I should say that I used to teach French and sometimes beginning Spanish. I have 2 bilingual grandchildren, ages 6 and 4. And the 6-year-old just turned 6, he's in kindergarten, is reading in both languages. But he thinks he's not reading because when his parents read a book that's written in English, they automatically translate it into Spanish as they're reading it. And he thinks that he has to not only read it, decode it, but translate it. Both children, the 4-year-old and the 6-year-old, have really large vocabularies. They only speak Spanish in the home, But then because they're both working parents, they were in daycare and preschool and all the way through. And those caregivers spoke English. So they seem to have an equivalent vocabulary in both languages. But then the question is, as the 5 or 6 year old starts to read, should he learn how to read in Spanish first, or what's going to happen with the two?
I think a lot depends on whether he's actually following the words, the printed words on the page, or whether he's just, listening to the words, in which case I would say probably expose him to English reading sooner rather than later, if English is the language of his environment.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the goals, though. If the goal is, oh, this kid should be able to live and work in Spain, in
Yeah,
the Spanish
exactly.
environment, then you might want to do the Spanish first to get a stronger level, because the English will come, if he lives in the US, right? The air is English. Yeah.
So this we refer to those bilinguals as what are called heritage speakers. So they're called heritage speakers because they're speaking the inherited language, if you like, the parents' language in the home, but then when they go outside, when they go to school, they're speaking English in say this case. And one of the things that is wonderful if one can do it is keep that language alive, keep the Spanish alive in the home. There's going to be plenty of exposure to English outside of the house, and in fact, if they are sort of preschool age, they're going to be taught to read when they get to school in English. Give them as much exposure to Spanish as they can. That you may notice the first few months there's some little confusions, but those really clear up very, very quickly.
Okay. I think I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people better.
Yes, good idea.
Okay.
Because they're still.
Oops, there we are. Yes.
Let's move them up.
Wayne, did you want to comment on that before we move on to Dale?
Yes, a co-worker in the federal government had a PhD in physics, and he told me as a child he would stand at the knee of his father or grandfather when they read to him from a book. And one day when he was old enough, he was handed a book to read, and he turned it upside down.
Yeah.
He learned to read upside down.
So that's quite common in cultures where, for example, people may be reading the Bible together or reading the Talmud or whatever it is as a family around the table. And I've heard of that many times where people can read upside down because of that.
Wait, Dale, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you for this very meaningful presentation. The earlier question about a child with hearing impairment reminded me of an observation I made some years ago that I thought you all might find interesting. It has to do with how children acquire emotional language as well as word vocabulary. I was making some observations at the Gallaudet University Child Development Center, which at the time had 3- and 4-year-olds in the classroom I was observing, and they had a practice of employing half teachers who were deaf and half hearing teachers, but all the hearing teachers also learned to sign so that all the communication was always in sign. And for those who could speak, they were also speaking to the children. And I saw a situation where a 3- or 4-year-old, a couple of kids got into a conflict, and one child came crying very loudly to the teacher and was exploding in hurt and anger and tears very loudly. And the teacher, who was one of the deaf teachers, responded by signing back to the child, at which point the child immediately switched off the sound, switched on her hands, and just became, I would say, more attuned to problem solving and not so much all of the terrible emoting, because the sound wasn't getting her anywhere.
Right.
Fantastic story.
That's great.
Fantastic.
That's great. Yeah, one of the it's popular now to teach babies to sign, hearing babies to do a little bit of signing for communication. I think there's some thought it might help with language skills later. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that, but there is good evidence that being able to communicate their needs and have their needs understood earlier makes it, improves their sort of relationship with their caregivers, sort of, makes them happier or more satisfied because they can actually express their needs.
The other nice thing about that anecdote is it does relate in some way to even adult bilinguals who will change their style, essentially change their personality, depending on which language they're speaking. So, for example, when I speak in Spanish or Italian, I'm gesturing more, my sense of humor is different, I become a different person. And there has been some work showing that even the kind of problem solving you will do differently depending on which language you're speaking, which is a little bit like you're describing with that child who went into sort of problem solving mode once he didn't have to waste all that time with the histrionics. We may have to steal that example from you and use it in our lecture.
Please do. Absolutely.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
See, Claire, yeah.
Thank you. I have not, when I went down below for more, I didn't come to finding out how to put my hand up, so I just figured I'd do it visually. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm a retired speech pathologist, so I found this very interesting. I'm retired, so a lot of what you're presenting is recent research and very interesting. But one of the things I wanted to mention is, of course, as babies get older, parents reinforce their knowledge of words, their meaning of words, and that is very strong. And whenever I'm in a supermarket and I see a parent with a child in the wagon and they're speaking to the child, well, this is salt and we need this. And so I always stop and tell them how important that is and how wonderful that is for their child's language development, to be talking to them all the time, even if they're just narrating what they're doing. It's very effective. And I remember learning in my graduate training about sound acquisition, and I don't know whether this was a theory. I think it was a proven fact that they did tests with babies and they learned how they acquired. First of all, we were told that they had all the sounds of all the languages, and the sounds that get reinforced are the ones they hear in their environment. Is that still believed?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of really good evidence for that. Yeah, it's fantastic.
I think that's very fascinating. Very
Just
fascinating.
to sort of blow our own basketball trumpet, a lot of that work was actually done here at the University of Connecticut and the Haskins Labs by someone called Al Lieberman. And that's been, incredibly.
Why don't you just elaborate on what the finding is?
The basic finding is that in English, for example, one can distinguish between a sound like bar and a sound like pa, depending on when you start vibrating the vocal folds here. So it's pa or bar, okay, with a long vibration. And one can generate a continuum of sounds. In fact, we often produce sounds along this continuum, just depending on whether we're speaking quickly or quietly, or stressed, whatever. And if you ask people, if you present by computer, you synthesize these sounds and you ask people to say, what label would you give this sound? Then as you go along this continuum, people say, that's a bar, that's a bar, that's a bar. Oh, that's a par, that's a par, that's a par. So there's quite a sudden cutoff. If you now present people two sounds from this side, where they were both, they were different sounds, but both would be labeled as bar, adults are not good at telling those sounds apart. If you do two sounds on this side that are both two different kinds of par sound, adults are not good at telling those apart.
To say they're different.
They can't say that they're different. But if you take the same difference and you put it here over where the switch happened, so you would think, so ordinarily somebody would label this a bar and this a par. Now people can tell that difference. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is that some languages have these boundaries between, for example, ba and pa in different places. We have one boundary, so we just have ba on one side, pa on the other side. So I can say bit or pit, and we just have two words that vary on that continuum of when we start vibrating the vocal folds. But in the Thai language, they have three they have three sounds. They have two boundaries. They have ba, pa, and pa that I can't do very well. Well, it turns out as adults, we can't tell, English speakers, we can't tell that Thai sound. We can't hear it, but babies can. And as they are reinforced in the language that they are speaking, and if they're English, after about 8 or 9 months, they start to lose the ability to distinguish that sound that is not actually used in English, but they are born with the ability to tell essentially all the differences between sounds that the world's languages have chosen.
As another example that might be more familiar to you, in English, we distinguish between la and ra, lock and rock. In Japanese, that's all one phoneme. Lock and rock would mean the same, well, it wouldn't be ka, but you know, la and I can't think of a Japanese sound, whatever, la and ra would be the same word. And so that's why often if you're talking to a native Japanese speaker who has English as a second language, they make this sort of error and the la's sound like ra's, or they have difficulty understanding you. It's really hard. When they were babies, they could tell. But as they learned that their language didn't distinguish between those, around 1 year of age, they lose the distinctions that aren't relevant for their language. Marilyn, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was wondering, does the tendency, I noticed that mothers are talking on their telephones quite a lot while they're strolling with their child. And I was wondering if any evidence that reduces the amount of exposure to words, or do they hear them talk on the phone? Because obviously the delivery is quite different on a phone than it is when they're talking to a baby.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of things to mention there. One of them is that when mothers are talking to their babies, most often,
or anyone's talking to babies,
or anyone's talking to babies, most often they use a very exaggerated sing-song, an exaggerated intonation. And so that attracts the attention of the baby, and the baby pays more attention than, for example, if an adult is speaking to another adult. That said, as in my case, for example, my parents would speak Spanish to one another, not to me. They weren't using that exaggerated intonation, but I could still pick that up. So that's one thing. The other thing, and we haven't mentioned this at all, we've been talking about babies and infants and young children as if they're just passive receivers, but they are not. They are little scientists who experiment with their language, and they use their language, and they get a lot of feedback about that language when they use it. And so that's something that is studied less, in fact, because it's much harder to get a handle on that, but it's undeniably quite important. For example, in my case, it's very effortful to speak in Spanish because I never had to speak in Spanish when I was a child. So it's no effort at all for me to understand Spanish, but it's a lot of effort to speak it. So the lack of interaction in the language really has a profound effect on children who can't interact.
Anne, yeah.
I was just wondering, being at the other end of the age continuum, if people are studying how older people lose language and what is, what kind of studies are being done and what could be done about learning more about that, since it seems to be happening a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting topic, and it's super interesting that you brought it up just now, because it turns out that one of the people who's been studying this is one of the sort of key figures in bilingualism research. And I mean, it may be no coincidence, but one of the reasons that she got into this was an observation that people have made, which is that as people get older, there's a general sort of cognitive slowing, but the ability to produce well-formed sentences remains intact in the face of other gradual slowing downs. And so where one does see big effects, of course, is as one gets older, one is more prone to things like stroke and other trauma to the brain, which does have a big impact on language. But in the absence of dementias, language remains intact in ways that are really quite extraordinary, given the other things that slowly start to be less efficient. But yes, it is studied. People are now seeing that there are some changes to the language faculty as people age, but it is still remarkably robust. And that's a puzzle. It could be due to the integrity of the blood supply that, keeps it very oxygenated compared to other parts of the brain that are used for other cognitive functions. For example, one thing that is traditionally associated with aging is a gradual loss of inhibition. So you see this loss, it's very, very common, but you don't see any equivalent kind of loss in language use. But, and this is where my friend who's a bilingual person comes in, when you're having to choose between a language, you're having to inhibit one language in order to speak the other. So one question that people have had is, as one gets older, does the ability to switch between languages change as that inhibitory ability starts to get lost? And I can't tell you the answer to that just yet.
Well, thank you.
All right.
I think we're getting to the
Yeah,
end of time.
yeah, we think we've worn you guys out. Well, thank you so much for
Yeah.
your attention. We enjoyed those questions. They were fantastic. And I noticed you guys are way better at unmuting yourselves than we are.
Oh, yeah.
It's where I was like, you're still muted, Joe.
Yeah. And one thing I want to thank you for is we actually took an existing lecture, as Eiling said, and we changed the graphics, we changed the animations, for this today. And we're so grateful to have had the opportunity to do that, because we're now going to use those same animations. As we've given the lecture, we learn little things that we need to change.
Try to improve
But it really is a huge improvement over what we have been using, even though the content is the same. So we're very grateful to have had that opportunity to work on this this lecture.
If I were you, I wouldn't hold Kai to the end. I think he's a winner, and you should put him near the front.
He is, yeah. And maybe if I mentioned that anecdote earlier, I wouldn't get so emotional. But for some reason or other, it just
he was
always.
really upset.
He was really upset.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again,
Yeah.
everyone.
Nice to
Thank
see
you so much.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
I think
Bye,
we'll
everyone.
have to have you back.
Bye, Sam.
Yeah. Bye, Dad.
Bye,
Bye, Aunt
Ginny.
Ginny.
Thank you.